I have been asked more than once how you know. Not how you react, not what you do with your hands or your heels or the 4 inches of rain between your fingers and a half-ton animal's mouth. Those things are trained into you until they stop being decisions. What people actually want to know, what they lean forward in their chairs to ask at regimental dinners, with their wine glasses tilted and their voices dropped, is how you know before anything has happened yet. I always give the same answer. You don't know, the horse knows. Your job is to be quiet enough to hear him. It was the 14th of June, 2019. Trooping the color had passed without incident 4 days earlier, which meant the regiment was carrying a particular kind of confidence. The loose, dangerous kind that comes from things going well. When things go well in the household cavalry, you don't celebrate, you recalibrate. You remind yourself that the procession that kills you is always the one after the one that didn't. I had been riding Sovereign for 2 years and 4 months. I knew his mouth the way you know a conversation you've had 1,000 times. The pauses, the hesitations, the places where he always considered saying something and never did. He was 17 years old, which in ceremonial horse terms meant he had forgotten more about state processions than most troopers would ever learn. He had been on the mall during a lightning strike. He had been on the mall when a press photographer's camera rig collapsed against the barrier at full metallic volume. He had been on the mall the day a protester threw a smoke canister that landed 6 feet from the column's left flank and bloomed orange. Each time, he had done what he was trained to do. Which is why, 3 minutes from the palace gates, when I felt something change in his neck, not a flinch, not a tension, just a shift in the frequency of the muscle directly beneath my left knee, I did not dismiss it. I did not look for the cause, not yet. The cause was Sovereign's problem for now. My job was my buttons. That is not a metaphor. In the seconds after I felt the frequency change, my brain trained, apparently, to find the most irrelevant possible object in a crisis and give it disproportionate attention, went immediately to my tunic buttons. 7 of them. Gold. State polished to a reflectivity that the inspecting officer that morning had described as adequate, which in household cavalry language meant, do not speak to me about these buttons again. Were they still adequate? Were they catching the right light? If Sovereign moved laterally, if the column shifted right, would the angle change, and would the buttons look adequate from the south side of the mall where the television cameras were stationed? The column moved forward. Sovereign's neck held its new frequency. I counted my buttons. 7 all present. We were 90 seconds from the trigger point, though I didn't know that yet. Her name, I later learned, was Chloe Merchant. 7 years old, from Swindon, wearing a red anorak that her mother would describe to a journalist 3 weeks later as her lucky coat. She wore it for everything. She had been at the barrier since 8:30 that morning, which was the kind of dedication that a 7-year-old from Swindon could sustain through pure excitement, and her mother could sustain through 3 flasks of tea, and the quiet understanding that this was the sort of memory a child keeps forever. Chloe had a balloon, silver foil, helium-filled, shaped in the rough approximation of a star. It had London printed across it in red letters. She had been holding its ribbon with both hands since they arrived, the way her mother had instructed, and she had been successful for 4 hours and 23 minutes. She was not successful at hour 4:24. The ribbon slipped. One moment it was in her fingers, the next it wasn't. I did not see any of this. I was in column position 4, eyes forward, counting my buttons. What I saw was not a child and not a mother lunging and not a crowd barrier and not the gap in the spectator line where the balloon had been released. What I saw was light. Specifically, I saw an irregular shape of reflected sunlight appear in my left peripheral field and begin moving, not falling, not dropping, but drifting, at approximately shoulder height, which is to say exactly the height at which a horse's lateral vision catches movement, and files it under the category labeled things that move like predators even when they are not predators. Silver foil, in sunlight at that height, moving that slowly, is, from a horse's perspective, approximately equivalent to the retinal signature of a large bird banking on a thermal. Sovereign did not know it was a balloon. Sovereign did not know it was from a shop in Paddington Station, or that it cost £4.50, or that a 7-year-old in a red lucky coat was watching it go, with the expression of someone watching a piece of their heart float upward. Sovereign knew one thing. Something was moving on the left, something reflective, something that moved the way things move when they intend to move toward you. The frequency in his neck changed again. This time it was not subtle. Here is what the cameras captured, nothing unusual. Here is what actually happened in the 4 seconds after the balloon entered the sightline of the column's left flank. Sovereign position 4 stopped. Not shied, not bolted, not reared, not any of the dramatic vocabulary of horse panic that people imagine when they imagine horse panic. He stopped, mid-stride, right foreleg extended, left foreleg loaded, the mechanical rhythm of a walk interrupted as completely as if someone had reached into the machinery and removed a gear. A horse stopped in a moving column is not a minor problem. A horse stopped in a moving column is a horse that is now a wall inside a structure that has no tolerance for walls. The horse behind Sovereign Constable, ridden by Trooper Dean Marsh, had approximately 1.5 seconds to register the stop and respond before contact. Marsh, to his credit, had Constable pulled and displaced left within that window. Clean. Correct. He found the gap and held it. The 2 horses ahead of me, Pemberton and Ajax, had registered the balloon at the same instant as Sovereign and had done what good ceremonial horses do with fear. They had compressed it, contained it, swallowed it somewhere deep in the chest and kept walking with the slightly elevated tension of an animal that is choosing, very deliberately, to continue choosing. I felt this in the column the way you feel weather change, not from evidence, but from pressure. Sovereign was not choosing. Sovereign was processing. And a horse mid-process is not a horse you can push, pull, or negotiate with. He was not panicking. He was not on the edge of flight. He was doing something more complex and more dangerous than either of those things. He was deciding. My buttons were still adequate. I noted this, and then noted that nodding it was insane, and then noted the insanity and still could not stop doing it. 6 buttons visible from the south camera position. The 7th was in column shadow. Sovereign had not moved. Lieutenant Graham Aldford had been in the regiment for 8 months. This is not a criticism. 8 months is a reasonable amount of time to learn a great many things about the household cavalry. It is not a reasonable amount of time to have developed the particular quality that the regiment's older NCOs called sitting knowledge, the kind of understanding that lives below language, in the base of the spine and the backs of the thighs, that knows what a horse is about to do before the horse knows. Aldford was in position 6, 2 behind Sovereign. He saw the stop. He saw the gap opening in the column. He saw the balloon, which by now had drifted past the barrier line and was ascending slowly toward the canopy of plane trees lining the mall's south edge. He made an assessment. The assessment was not wrong exactly. It was simply made at the wrong speed with the wrong instrument. He pressed his horse, Garrison, forward into the gap. Garrison was not ready to move forward into a gap adjacent to a stopping horse, adjacent to a drifting reflective object. Garrison was a good horse. Garrison would do what he was asked. Garrison did what he was asked with the visible, full-body reluctance of an animal that wished, very clearly, to be asked something else. What this created was a second pressure point in the column's left flank. Sovereign, already stopped and processing, now had movement arriving from his rear left quadrant. A horse in the processing state does not interpret rear left movement as assistance. It interprets it as encirclement. I felt Sovereign's weight shift. Not forward, not backward. Sideways. 2 degrees, maybe 3. The lateral shift of an animal considering whether the space to its right is safer than the space to its left. A pre-bolt micro-movement so small that most people standing 6 feet away would not have seen it. I had been on Sovereign's back for 2 years and 4 months. I saw it. My buttons, 7 buttons. The 7th was still in shadow. I was losing my mind about the 7th button. I noted that the 7th button's shadow situation was genuinely not relevant to anything happening and could not, for reasons I still cannot fully explain, let it go. 2 problems now. 2 horses in adjacent states of alarm, one going still and one being pushed, and the column was a living structure, and living structures do not absorb 2 stress points simultaneously without consequence. To my left, 12 feet away, a section of crowd barrier shifted as people pressed forward to see what the horses were doing. The sound was metallic, brief, sharp. Sovereign's ear rotated toward it. There is a page in the Household Cavalry Mounted Regiment's ceremonial riding manual. I have read it so many times I can reconstruct it from memory, that addresses horse management during column disruption. It has 4 numbered points. Each point has sub-points. The language is precise, institutional, and completely useless if what is in front of you is a 17-year-old horse in the middle of a live state procession on the Mall, with 12 million pounds of architectural tradition, watching from either side of a 200-meter corridor. The manual tells you what to do with your hands. It does not tell you what to do with your breathing. I had learned what to do with my breathing from a staff corporal named Thomas Heward, who had retired from the regiment in 2016 after 22 years, and who had, on a wet Tuesday morning in the Hyde Park Riding School approximately 3 years before this moment, told me the following thing. When it goes wrong, the horse is going to feel your heart rate before you do. So the question isn't what you do with your hands. The question is which one of you is going to decide what this moment is. I had thought about this statement many times. I had thought about it when things were fine, when there was time to think, when I could turn it over carefully like an object I was trying to understand. I thought about it now without thinking, the way you don't think about your footing when you run downstairs in the dark. I dropped my weight. Not down in the saddle, into the saddle. There is a difference. Down is a movement. Into is a state. I let my spine lengthen and my hips release and my thighs go heavy, and I took one breath that started in my chest and ended deliberately, slowly, in my stomach. I did nothing with my hands. I did nothing with my heels. I stopped trying to manage Sovereign and I became, instead, the most boring and stable and unremarkable physical presence I was capable of becoming. I became ballast. I became the thing at the center of a boat that keeps the boat from tipping, not active, not forceful, not communicating anything except mass and stillness and the absolute conviction, transmitted entirely through my seat bones, that this moment was not an emergency. Sovereign's ear rotated. The shift in his weight stopped. He had been at 3 degrees lateral. He went to 2, then 1. The balloon was still ascending. It had cleared the plain trees. It was now approximately 40 feet above the Mall, catching sun on its upper surface, and it was entirely out of any horse's sightline. Sovereign did not know this yet. His nervous system was still running the calculation. I gave him nothing to calculate except stillness. My buttons. 7, 6th in direct sun now, as the column's angle had shifted slightly toward the south. The 7th still in partial shadow but improving. I was, at this particular moment, simultaneously managing the finest ceremonial horse in the Household Cavalry's active roster through the beginning of a potential column collapse, and experiencing genuine concern about Button 7's lighting situation. This is what the body does. It finds an object. It holds it. It keeps the hands busy so the train parts can work. Sovereign stood, still in column, still stopped, but the weight had come back to center. He was no longer deciding. He was waiting. I breathed again, same breath, chest to stomach, slow. "All right," I said, not loudly, not urgently. The word dropped into the 6 inches of air between my mouth and his left ear with the weight of complete conviction. All right. I have never been able to explain, in any debrief or conversation or regimental dinner, what all right actually communicated to a 17-year-old horse. I know only that it communicated something. That in the register in which horses receive language, not the words but the architecture of the breath behind the words, all right, said what it needed to say. Sovereign's right foreleg completed the stride it had abandoned. He was moving. Major Patricia Renshaw was at the front of the escort column. She had joined the regiment in 2004, which meant she had been doing this since before some of the troopers behind her had started secondary school. She was the first female senior officer to lead a state procession escort in the regiment's recorded history, a fact that had been reported in 3 national newspapers, and that she had, by all accounts, found mildly irritating. Not because it wasn't true or wasn't significant, but because on the day it was reported, she had been trying to finalize the column spacing for 17 horses, and the journalists kept calling the press office. She had not turned around during any of the preceding 45 seconds. She did not need to. The Household Cavalry's mounted column operates on a radio channel that carries, during state processions, almost no voice traffic. Positioning adjustments are communicated through leg and weight. Emergencies are communicated through a specific radio click pattern, 2 short, 1 long, that means stop everything. Everything else is silence. In 45 seconds of column disruption, nobody had clicked, which meant it was being handled, or it was about to stop being handleable. And in either case, the front of the column continuing to move correctly was the thing that gave the rest of the column something to aim at. Renshaw knew this. She had known it for 15 years. She spoke once, 4 words, through the column's radio channel, in the tone of someone reading a weather report. Close the gap 4. That was the entirety of it. Not a reprimand, not a question, not an acknowledgement that anything unusual had happened or was happening or had nearly happened. Just the clean, flat statement of what was required next, delivered in the register of someone who had complete confidence that the person she was speaking to knew how to do it. There is a particular feeling that comes from being spoken to that way by a superior officer in a crisis. Not the feeling of being commanded. Something more specific than that. It is the feeling of being assumed competent, of having someone in authority look at the situation, look at you, and decide without hesitation that you are adequate to the moment. I have tried to describe this feeling at regimental dinners. I have never done it justice. What I can say is this: Renshaw's 4 words did more for Sovereign's nervous system than anything I had done in the preceding 45 seconds. Because Sovereign felt what they did to me. He felt my spine settle into the saddle with the finality of something decided. He felt the micro-release in my hip flexors that comes when a person stops bracing against a possible future and accepts the present one. He felt, in the language of weight and warmth and breath that is the only language he had ever needed, that the person on his back had received information and found it sufficient. I pressed gently with my left leg. He moved right, closing the gap ahead. To my rear, I heard Marsh bring Constable back into position with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been waiting for exactly this signal. The column sealed around the repair the way a river closes around a stone that has been removed. 2 meters, maybe 3, the gap that had opened was gone. The south cameras, I would confirm later when I reviewed the footage in the barracks common room at 11 that night, had captured nothing unusual, a slight compression in column spacing, the kind of micro-adjustment that happens in every procession and that nobody notices because nobody is looking for it. Button 7, for what it is worth, was in full sun by the time we reached the palace gates. The palace gates opened at the correct time. The column turned in the correct formation, the spacing held. The horses, all 17 of them, including Sovereign, including Garrison, including Constable, completed the entry sequence with the kind of mechanical precision that looks effortless from the outside and represents, from the inside, the accumulated result of thousands of hours of work by horses and riders and stable staff and farriers and saddlers, and a regimental support structure so deep and so old that most of it has stopped needing to be written down. The dignitaries on the steps saw what they were meant to see. Rows of brass and scarlet, horses moving as one organism, the ceremonial weight of an institution that had been doing this in some form, under some version of these rules for 300 years. They did not see a 17-year-old horse stopping mid-stride on the mall because a child from Swindon had lost her grip on a foil balloon. They did not see a junior lieutenant overcorrecting into a gap that wasn't his to fill yet. They did not see a trooper in position 4 losing a brief but sincere argument with himself about button 7, while simultaneously making the most important physical decision of his riding career. They did not see Major Patricia Renshaw holding the front of a column together through 45 seconds of silence followed by 4 words. They saw a procession, which was the point, which had always been the point. The crowd along the mall saw it too, the flags, the horses, the gleam of ceremonial armor in June sun, the whole moving architecture of state occasion that people travel from Swindon and everywhere else to stand at barriers since 8:30 in the morning for. They pressed forward at the barriers. They raised their phones. They photographed what they understood, which was spectacle, which was tradition, which was the surface of a thing whose depth they had no reason to wonder about. Somewhere on the mall, 40 feet above the plane trees, a silver balloon continued its ascent. By the time the column cleared the gates, it was a small point of reflected light against a pale London sky. I watched it go. Or rather, I allowed myself, for exactly 2 seconds, to find it and mark it before returning my eyes to the column ahead. It caught the sun once more, a single flash of reflected light, the brief signature of a thing that had caused an enormous amount of concentrated human effort and had no idea, and then it was gone into the sky. The gates closed, nobody filed a report. This is not as unusual as it sounds. In the household cavalry, the threshold for formal incident documentation during a state procession is defined, with institutional precision, as any disruption visible to press, public, or attending dignitaries resulting in deviation from approved ceremonial protocol. What happened on the mall on the 14th of June, 2019 met none of those criteria. The cameras saw nothing. The crowd saw nothing. The dignitaries saw nothing. From the regiment's official perspective, nothing happened. Aldford said nothing at evening stables. He moved through his post-procession duties with the focused efficiency of a man who had made a decision, understood it had been the wrong decision, and was processing that understanding in the particular interior way that young officers learn to process things when they are in an institution that does not reward public self-flagellation. I did not speak to him about it. It was not my place. He would carry it himself to wherever he needed to carry it, and in a year or 2 or 5, it would become the thing he told new troopers without nomming himself in the story. That is how institutional memory actually travels, not through manuals, through the edited autobiography of people who were there. Marsh found me in the tack room at 7:30. He said, "Clean work, Whitfield," and then began cleaning his bridle with the focused attention of a man who considered the subject closed. I said nothing. The subject was closed. He was right and we both knew it, and that was sufficient. I went to Sovereign's stall at 8. I did not have a reason. There was no task remaining. The evening feed had been done, the tack checked and stored, the stall bedded fresh. There was nothing left to do with Sovereign that evening except be there, which is sometimes the only available response to a day that has required more of you than you expected. He was standing at the back of the stall, hip dropped, resting the way horses rest when they have decided the day is over. I let myself in and stood with my back against the stall door, and after a few minutes he turned his head and looked at me with the enormous lateral eye that horses use for the world, and I looked back at him with whatever was left of my face after a full day of state procession composure. He went back to resting. I thought about Thomas Heward and the wet Tuesday in the Hyde Park riding school, and the question he had asked me that I had been turning over ever since. Which one of you is going to decide what this moment is? The answer I had always assumed was, you decide. The rider decides. That is the hierarchy. That is the entire premise of a trained horse carrying a trained rider through a structure built on the premise of control. Sitting in Sovereign's stall at 8 o'clock on the 14th of June, I understood that this was not quite right. What actually happened on the mall, what happened in the 45 seconds between the balloon's release and Renshaw's 4 words, was not that I decided what the moment was and communicated it to Sovereign. It was that I stopped deciding anything. I stopped filling the space between us with the noise of my own management. I became still enough that Sovereign could feel, through the seat of my weight and the architecture of my breath, that the person on his back was not afraid. And a horse who cannot feel fear in his rider has nothing to mirror. This is not in the manual. This is the thing that doesn't fit in a manual because it cannot be numbered or subpointed or assessed on a training sheet. It is the thing that gets transmitted, imperfectly, incompletely, across the gaps of language and rank and institutional formality, from someone like Thomas Heward to someone like me on a wet Tuesday, and then from me to whoever sits in this tack room in 20 years doing their own version of this inventory. Major Patricia Renshaw passed Sovereign's stall at 20 past 8. She was in her stable clothes, the regiment's version of off-duty, which meant her uniform was slightly less formal but no less precise. She did not stop. She glanced in through the half-door with the brief, comprehensive assessment of an officer doing a final check, confirmed that the horse and the trooper were both present and in acceptable condition, and continued down the stable corridor. She said nothing. She did not need to. She had said 4 words at the right moment. That was already more than most situations received from Major Renshaw, and everyone in the regiment knew it. I sat for another 20 minutes. Sovereign's breathing was slow and rhythmic in the warm stall air. Outside, London was doing what London does at 8 in the evening in June. All its visible busyness, all its noise and traffic and tourist crowds, completely indifferent to what had happened that afternoon in the corridor of plane trees along the mall. The crowds at the barriers had gone home. Chloe Merchant in her red lucky coat was presumably in the back of a car on the M4, probably asleep. The silver balloon had traveled, in the hours since its release, up through the plane trees, up past the roof lines, up into the open air above the city, and was by now so high and so far that it had joined the invisible inventory of things that were released today and will not be coming back. I thought about Button 7. I thought about the fact that I had, in the middle of the most precise and high-stakes 45 seconds of my riding career, devoted some non-trivial portion of my available attention to the question of whether my 7th tunic button was receiving adequate sun coverage from the south camera position. I thought about this for a moment. Then I understood, not as an embarrassment, but as a fact, that the buttons were exactly why it had worked. The buttons were where I put the noise. They were the object I gave my management instinct to hold, while the trained part of me did what the trained part knew. You cannot empty your mind on the mall. You cannot achieve ceremonial riding through the absence of thought. You can only redirect the anxious, controlling, button-counting part of your brain towards something small and irrelevant, while the part of you that was built for this takes the weight. Thomas Heward had a phrase for this too. He had a phrase for everything. He called it finding your buttons, giving your interference somewhere to go. I had thought he was speaking metaphorically. I let myself out of the stall. Sovereign did not look up. The day was fully over for him now, archived somewhere in his enormous, ancient, uncomplicated nervous system, alongside all the lightning strikes and smoke canisters and press rig collapses, filed under things that happened and passed. He would be here tomorrow. He would be correct tomorrow. He would carry whoever rode him with the same heavy, honest weight he had always carried. And when something reflective drifted across his vision on some future procession day, his body would do its calculation, and his rider's job would be to have nothing in the way of the answer. I walked back down the stable corridor through the smell of straw and horses, and the particular warmth of large animals at rest. Nothing had been filed. Nothing had been recorded. From the institution's perspective, the 14th of June, 2019, was a state procession that proceeded without incident. From mine, it was the day I learned that the most important thing a rider can do in a crisis is become temporarily unimportant. Give the horse nothing to mirror. Give your noise somewhere small to live. And trust in the body, not the manual, not the way you trust an argument, but the way you trust your hands on a dark staircase. That what has been trained into you will be there when the moment asks for it. It will be there. It always has been. That, as far as I have ever been able to determine, is what the 300 years are for. James Whitfield served in the Household Cavalry Mounted Regiment from 2012 to 2021. He left the regiment at the rank of Lance Corporal of Horse and currently works as an equine behavioral consultant in Wiltshire. Sovereign was retired from ceremonial service in 2021 at the age of 19 and lives at the regiment's operational stud in Norfolk. He is, by all accounts, in excellent health.